Volume.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
You know, last week we talked about some sanctions and a sanction bill that was passed in the Senate a couple weeks ago. And of course, we were explaining why that wasn't a good idea. But the senators, voted for it overwhelmingly, 97-2. And then when this bill went to the House, all of a sudden said, oh, it's a technicality, nothing wrong with the bill, but we think we have to exert our constitutional responsibilities in the House, because only in the House can we pass these bills that involve, taxes and this sort of thing. They claim jurisdiction, which at the time I made a bit of fun of that, because all of a sudden they're constitutionalists on this technicality. Well, others thought, well, maybe what's going on here is that Trump wants to sort of slow this down because he's been on record of not bashing Russia. And these sanctions were mostly against Russia and some against, I think, Iran. And so we thought maybe, or at least some people thought, well, maybe what he wants to do is stop this and make it a better bill and back off on something of this. Well, it turns out that the House has worked on it. They worked on it over the weekend. This is a big deal. And all of a sudden, magic occurred over the weekend, and they have a bill now that's going to be super good. And they're going to bring it to the floor, the House floor, tomorrow, most likely, to vote. But instead of improving the bill, or maybe backing off and not having this Russophobia, dominating and dwelling on sanctions, which they think are absolutely sacred in our foreign policy, they've made this thing worse. They've expanded it to include North Korea, and they have limited the president, if he ever did want to ease off a little bit on these sanctions. The traditional thing was that the president would have some leeway. They eliminated that. So the bill is absolutely worse than it was. But the principle of sanctions is there. It's alive and well. And, of course, our position is that Mr. President veto this bill. And I hope the American people wake up, and maybe it's going to take a lot of action, though, between now and tomorrow, for the people to, get their message to Congress. But in fact, it's not that type of issue that sort of grabs a lot of people. More people, I guess, are still wondering about who spied on whom, in the election, which is totally irrelevant. Now, this issue is a big issue, especially if you recognize that sanctions are not healthy for the safety of the world. And we dealt with this subject on all the sanctions that lasted for 10 years against Iraq, and kept saying, sanctions lead to war, sanctions lead to war, and that, of course, is my big concern. So I'm sure you've kept up with this pretty much. I can't believe you can find much optimism in what's going on in the House right now.
Well, I think politically, this indicates that the Republican Party, which controls the House and Senate, most people wouldn't realize that by what's happening, which is nothing, no Obamacare repeal, nothing, but the Republicans actually control Congress. This, I think, is an absolute surrender of the Republican Party to this Democrat warmongering over Russia. They basically just said, we give up, and the president's caught in the crossfire. The mainstream media presents it as a cross-party revolt. This is from Vanity Fair. Cross-party revolt over Trump's refusal to hit Putin over the supposed interference in the elections. So what's happened is that Trump has also had to surrender. He was put out in the front of the firing squad by his Republican colleagues, and now he's indicated that he will sign the bill. However, it's not signed until the ink is dry.
Right. But this is something that demonstrates how Washington is put together now. Some people still believe it's Republicans, they're the conservative, the liberal Democrats are over here, and they argue over Obamacare. Republicans are for free market medicine, and the Democrats are for socialized medicine. That's back and forth, which is fiction. And for the most part, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, even though they fight, they always get the bills passed. Their foreign policies are always the same. But what's happened now is Trump has thrown in a monkey wrench with his rhetoric during the campaign, which is a mixed bag now. So we never know where he stands. So the coalition has held together, not the old one of the Republican Party leadership and the Democrat Party leadership to promote these things, because the Republican Party is split. We have the Trump people in charge, but we still have, the people, actually the leaders in the House and the Senate are still the old-time Republicans, and they are neocons, basically. So all of a sudden, we know the Democrats are pro-war. They've been that way. So all of a sudden, the coalition is still there. It's just, if you want to describe it, it's a three-way deal, but I think it's the same group of people. And in another way, I think with Trump capitulating, he in many ways has capitulated to the deep state. The people who really control things. And this is a foreign policy issue that is very important. And down with Russia, and they're beating up on them. And of course, I consider this wrong, and it won't help anything. And we'll talk a little bit about, whose ox is getting gored. There's some people now internationally are saying, "Hey, hold on, America, who do you think you are?"
Yeah.
There's some treaties there that you signed onto, and all of a sudden you don't care. So I think that we're going to hear some noise from some people who are going to suffer from this over and above our concerns about this leading to all-out war, this type of operation. Over time, I think it invites hostilities.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, both parties, as everyone knows, are for war, are for conflict. Both parties in Congress are that way. But the president was elected with different rhetoric. He was elected by saying, let's get along with Russia, let's stop trying to run the world, let's put an end to all this nation building. That's really what put him in the margin of error. But you're right, you point out that he's not able to stand. He's basically, through his incompetence, he has hired people to serve him that are in bed with the neocons. From top to bottom. So he basically has all of his ammunition he's thrown overboard, and now he's going to go to war with Congress. It's absolutely impossible.
Well, you're right. He's at war with his own staff, his people. And right now, a new conflict has been brought about on this very issue, because he said that the reporting is, and you have to wonder what is all true or not. But the reports are that he and Tillerson, Trump and Tillerson, really got into it because Trump was angry at certifying Iran, that they are obeying the law, which everybody in the world knows that, except the people who want war with Iran and with Russia. So he's hacked off at Tillerson, and they're at each other. And the suggestion now is, wait till next go around. Every 90 days they have to be certified, but the Iranians aren't going to get certified anymore. So that conflict is being built up. Here's this hand-picked guy, and they have two policies out in the open, and unfortunately, well, on this case, if you want to look for credit, you got to give Trump credit. He's hated Iran for a long time.
That's true. He's consistent there.
He vacillates with Russia, but now the pressure on those who are with him against, for bashing Iran, are moving him over on Russia. But never once do they question, whether or not our alliance and dedication and total loyalty and subsidization and looking the other way for a country like Saudi Arabia. No discussion at all. I mean, if you want to compare things, compare that country and how we treat them versus what we're doing now, with Russia and Putin, it's unbelievable. And it's hard for us trying to get this information out to get the people interested, but it's very significant.
And the mainstream media has spun this, and this is how they report it. That these are a sanctions bill, we got to punish these bad guys. Never does it go beyond, what is this bill about? Okay, what is the sanctions on Russia for? Well, they're for Ukraine. They're for supposedly hacking our elections. Well, we know on Ukraine, we started it. The U.S., there's video, there's Victoria Nuland in the streets. There's John McCain before a rally to overthrow the legally elected president. There's Ambassador Jeff Pyatt in the streets telling them, overthrow your government. You talk about interfering in someone's, we started in Ukraine. And as far as the hacking, as you know, we had Scott Ritter on a little while ago saying this whole, even just these 3 intelligence agencies report on the Russian interference is very, very, very sketchy. They're hand-picked analysts, exactly like with Iraq, stovepipe intelligence, but it's not being reported that way, you know.
Now, the coup in Ukraine, we can't get Trump involved in that. That was before his time. We had a peace candidate, a peace president by the name of Obama. He's the one, and he was out in the open. Yes, we pulled this off. We pulled this coup off because of the Iranian or the Russians being such bad people. But they never talk about what were some of the promises made, after World War II, that NATO was not to be expanded eastward past Germany. It's all around Russia now. And here we are involved in this. Ukraine, happens to be a next door neighbor of Russia. That doesn't justify any harm done. But what you point out is the coup. The biggest thing is the overthrow of a legitimate government. Yanukovych was thrown out, and guess what, by whom? United States, NATO, and the European nations. Now, those same nations that participated in this coup because they had to be anti-Russian are the same ones crying, well, maybe the United States is going too far. We in Europe should be able to define our own destiny. And we're getting cheap gas and we're getting royalties for the use of pipelines. And they like this, and now they're changing their tune. So they want their cake and eat it too. They want to be strong anti-Russia. At the same time, there's trade going on. And then when you get into the depths of which oil companies are benefiting. The suggestion is that Americans can sell, if we cut off the gas coming from Russia into Europe, we'll sell them our gas because it's cheap. Yeah, sure. Yeah, we're going to ship it on a boat and make it the same efficiency of getting it. But there's oil companies, Exxon, Mobil, and some of the other big ones, other American companies say, hey, hold off on these sanctions. These sanctions aren't good. So you have European companies, you have some American companies are for it, some American companies against it, and it's a good time for people to think seriously about what are the benefits of sanctions? Does more harm come than good? And our argument in the 80s was, or in the 90s, is don't keep the sanctions and the bombing on Iraq. It could lead to a bad war and a bad outcome, and we're still at war there. But they won't look at these initial causes, the setting of the stages, and this is just more, setting of the stage for a conflict, and throw away any effort and openness to maybe work something out with Russia. Oh, well, they're bad people. But then the evidence, when you look at their excuses, Russia did this, Russia did that, at the same time, we're the ones that created the disturbance in Ukraine. They say, well, what about Crimea? Do they have a legitimate complaint about Crimea? That seems to be a diplomatic discussion that we never hear about.
Yeah, and that's all about the timeline. The coup happened. The U.S. was behind the coup. We have it on video. We have the cookies being passed out. We heard the EU phone call. We know what happened. So what happened after the new U.S.-backed government took over in Ukraine? Well, one of the first things they did is they tried to ban the use of Russian as an official language. They backed off that, but that was the initial thing. And that set up red flags in places like Crimea, which is like 90% Russian, in places like eastern Ukraine, which voted 90% for Yanukovych. All of a sudden, they're told they can't use their language. So what did Crimea do? They organized a referendum and said, okay, guys, we need to decide if we want to leave this country, if it's going to ban our language. Most people voted to leave, and so Russia said, okay, we respect your vote. They rejoined Russia, but somehow it's presented as if the Russians invaded Crimea. They're already there because they had a base there and took it back.
You mean they had the audacity to talk about self-determination?
They had a vote. How dare they?
There's been some lip service given to self-determination, which is just lip service because most great nations don't even believe in it. So that is a major problem, but people don't want to see this. And then they get into this, well, we have to put on sanctions because they've interfered in elections. Well, we mentioned the coup, but didn't we come across a statistic that was pretty reliable 100 different times since World War I or World War II that we've been involved that we've been involved in the elections, and we admit it. It's out in the open, and we're always involved in regime change. I mean, we could probably run down a list of 10 times in the last 10, 15 years, of all the regime change, and they worked out, rather well. Everything's going well in Libya. Everything's going well in Ukraine. Everything's going well in Iraq. Everything's going well in Syria. Everything's going well in Afghanistan. So we are the champions of democracy and regime change, and yet what are we going to do? And then they come down, but the Iranians, they commit more terrorism than anybody else. I think there's some flaws in that statement as well.
Well, when's the last time Iran has attacked the U.S. in a terrorist act? Zero. It never has.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a terrorist record. Most terrorism around the world is sponsored by Saudi Arabia. That's just a fact.
And I think they've committed a little bit of aggression with Yemen. That's going on. And we're morally guilty. We're financially guilty. We're there, and we're a participant in that. We never say boo about that. We never say a single thing. And here we are, ready to precipitate violence, against the Iranian people. People literally, want to bomb Iran. And of course, this resolution on sanctions was expanded because they had to include North Korea. It's easy to go after North Korea, but we've suggested, it has to be dealt with. But the people most vulnerable, the country most vulnerable to what North Korea might do, South Korea.
Yeah.
And most of us believe South Korea is quite capable of taking care of themselves. So their foreign policy desires, and they just had an election, I believe, and the president is sympathetic to at least talking with the North Koreans. But no, you can't have that. What we'll do is send some more Navy forces over there and put more troops on the DMZ to make sure, and then if you happen to say and imply what we're talking about, oh, you like that guy in North Korea. But he gets too much credibility when we pay that much attention to him.
Yeah. And, just to touch back on the European response, I think it could be significant. The Europeans, as you've said, they want their cake and eat it too. They love going along with the coup. But now that it's going to hit their bottom line, they're starting to panic. The European commissioners had promised a response within days if this bill becomes law. They're concerned that their European companies that are involved in the construction of things like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and other pipeline projects, these are big European firms that are building these. These are a lot of people working. These are a lot of jobs. These may fall under sanctions if they are involved in it, and they're very concerned about it. They talk about unintended consequences. I think we may reach the threshold. There's a possibility with both Russia and Iran, because we talked about last week, business between Iran and the EU has increased 78% last year. So they're doing more business. If the U.S. finally comes up and says, shut it down, you can't do it anymore, I think you might see the breaking point where the EU finally says, enough is enough. We're going to have to break with you on this.
See, now it's easier to be more sympathetic with what the Europeans are saying, because they're looking for a sort of a peaceful solution. But we were less sympathetic with them when they joined in the warmongering of NATO and putting, all the troops right up on the Russian border, and also, overthrowing the government of Ukraine. So this is something that I think is ripe for a big problem. The big question now, the immediate question, because here we are, on Monday, and Tuesday they possibly could have an election or a vote tomorrow in the House, but the fact that they put North Korea in it means that it has to go back to the Senate. This is not, it's not the bill the Senate wrote. Now, if, so the strategy was to make the bill tougher, not to make sure that the House was following constitutional guidelines. You know, they go to war and they bail out big companies to the tune of $15 trillion. Now they're worrying about the Constitution here. So they are doing that, and I just think that this is not going to work very well. It's not going to come out well.
There's two chances then for people to contact their congressmen, their senators, and tell them they don't want this. If I can add a final word, if you don't mind, and I'm going to have a hat tip to Justin Raimondo's column today on this issue, but he points out some other things, and it's how sad to lower the conversation, but a lot of this is about money. I know that's shocking. But the sanctions bill is going to have $250 million appropriated for anti-Russian propaganda. It's the Countering Russian Influence Fund. And you know what this is. This is a big slush fund for NGOs, for George Soros and all of his groups. They're all going to suck up this money. It's going to fund all this. Just a huge waste. The other thing is there's about $30 million to pay for free gas for Ukraine. And I'm sure Americans this winter who can't afford their gas bills are going to be happy to have given this gift to Ukraine. A lot of boondoggle money in here as well.
That's right, good point. And I would like to suggest that I would cancel all that spending, but I would save $2 million of it to investigate, have a serious investigation by a few scholars to find out the significance of our participation in other governments' elections and interference and that kind of thing. Why don't we know how we have interfered, and how did we contribute to the problem of Europe when we go in and have regime change in Ukraine and all these other places? We ought to know how our policies do this. I said, well, you can't attack America. You're unpatriotic. You're not pro-American. You're pro-Russian and this sort of thing. We're pro-truth. We want to know what's going on, and I think that's the most patriotic thing a person could do, is to seek out the truth about their own government and to find out if there are errors made and do what we can to correct them. So that is one effort that we put forth here at this channel, to make sure that the American people have a source, because you're not going to see this information or hear this information about how we make mistakes. And the simple answer to this is we have made a huge mistake, especially in the last 100 years, when we assumed the role of the world policeman, that we are to police the world and that we are to be involved in internal affairs of other nations and make the world safe for democracy by throwing out dictators and then put in a different dictator. So it's time we decide what kind of a government we want. Do we want a government that's dedicated to protecting our liberties and let us solve our problems? Or are we dedicated to more of this corporatism and cronyism, which is deeply embedded in the sanctions program? But hopefully truth wins out in the end, and that's what we'll continue to work for. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.